The velvet of Sienna's emerald gown whispered against the cold marble as she moved through the Romano estate, but she couldn't hear it anymore. The sound of her own heartbeat had drowned out everything else. 3 years. 3 years of loving a man who looked at her like she was both salvation and suspicion, wrapped in the same breath. Like a masterpiece he'd bought but couldn't quite believe was real. Tonight, their anniversary party filled the estate with champagne laughter and the clink of crystal that cost more than most people's cars. 29 years old and living in a gilded cage she'd walked into willingly. That was what Sienna Ross Romano had become. The former art curator who traded gallery walls for estate halls, independence for devotion, certainty for the beautiful chaos of loving Marco Romano, the most dangerous man in New York. Sometimes she wondered if he truly saw her, or if she was just another priceless acquisition in his collection. Another thing to protect, to control, to test. That night, the Romano estate was celebrating. But beneath the classical music and designer gowns, beneath the practiced smiles of men whose hands had spilled blood, security moved like shadows. Armed guards in tailored suits couldn't quite hide the weapons holstered beneath Italian wool. Their eyes swept corners with the vigilance of soldiers expecting war. Sienna glided through the grand hall, diamonds glittering at her throat. A gift from Marco on their first anniversary, but she felt the weight of more than just jewels. She felt watched, always watched. She slipped away from the crowd, seeking a moment of quiet in the library where Marco often retreated. But she smelled him before she saw him. Tom Ford cologne and aged whiskey, leather-bound books and something darker beneath it all. Something that made her pulse quicken the way it always did. Danger and desire, tangled together so tightly, she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Running from your own party, cara mia? The voice came from the shadows near the mahogany bookshelves, low and smooth as smoke. Sienna turned, and her breath caught. Marco stood framed by lamplight, a figure carved from power and sharp edges. 36 years old and devastating in his navy blue three-piece suit that fit him like a second skin. Broad shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. A face made of aristocratic bone and ruthless lines. The kind of handsome that made you think of fallen angels, beautiful and damned. Dark hair slicked back, revealing storm-dark eyes that held ancient secrets and fresh wounds. The close-cropped beard that framed lips she'd kissed 1,000 times but still made her knees weak. But what unsettled Sienna most tonight was his stillness. He didn't move toward her, didn't smile. He simply existed in that space like a predator watching, calculating, deciding something she couldn't name. "I needed air," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Too many people asking too many questions about us." He tilted his head, studying her the way he studied chess opponents before destroying them. "What kind of questions? The kind that wonder why you married a nobody curator. The kind that think I'm after your money." She stepped closer, the emerald fabric of her gown pooling around her feet. "The kind that don't understand that I'd burn every dollar you have if it meant keeping you." Something flickered in those dark eyes. Pain, maybe, or doubt. "Would you?" The question landed like a blade between ribs. "Marco, what? If I lost everything tomorrow?" he interrupted, his voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. "If the empire crumbled, if I became nothing but a man with a target on his back and ghosts in his past, would you stay?" Sienna closed the distance between them, placed her hand over his heart, felt it beating beneath expensive fabric, an expensive watch, and expensive walls he'd built around himself. "I didn't marry the empire. I married the man who reads Neruda at 3 in the morning when he can't sleep. The man who's afraid of thunderstorms but won't admit it. The man who cries during old movies and pretends he doesn't." His hand covered hers, rough and scarred beneath the gold signet ring bearing his family crest. The neck tattoos that peeked above his collar seemed darker tonight, shadows of a violent past he'd never fully escaped. "You see too much." "I see you," she whispered. "All of you, the monster and the man. And I love both." For a moment, Marco's carefully constructed mask cracked. His free hand lifted to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted every rumor whispered about him in the city's dark corners. "Sienna, The gunshot split the air like the world breaking in half. Then another, and another. Screaming erupted from the main hall. Guests scattering, bodyguards shouting commands, the sound of running feet and shattering glass. Marco's body went rigid, every muscle coiling for violence. His hand dropped from her face to the gun holstered at his back. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the door. "Lock it behind me. Don't come out until Dante gives the all-clear." But Sienna grabbed his arm, her nails digging into expensive fabric. "Marco, don't. I said stay here." His voice turned to steel, the mafia boss eclipsing the husband. Then he was gone, disappearing into the chaos beyond the library door. Sienna stood frozen, her heart a wild thing trying to claw out of her chest. She heard shouting, more gunshots, the distinctive sound of Marco's voice barking orders. Commanding, cold, utterly in control. Then silence. Terrible, suffocating silence that felt like death holding its breath. She should have stayed, should have listened. But when she heard the single, final shot followed by a heavy thud, her body moved before her mind could stop it. She ran toward the sound, emerald gown trailing behind her like a flag of surrender, diamonds bouncing against her throat with each frantic step. The scene in Marco's private study stole the air from her lungs. 3 masked figures were climbing through shattered windows, disappearing into the night. Dante, Marco's second-in-command, was shouting into a phone for medical assistance. And on the mahogany floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled whiskey, lay Marco Romano. Blood spreading across his crisp white shirt in a crimson bloom that looked obscene against the elegance of his navy suit. His face gray, his breathing shallow, one hand clutched to his chest while the other reached out toward nothing. "No!" The word ripped from Sienna's throat. "No, no, no!" She fell to her knees beside him, the impact sending pain shooting through her legs, but she couldn't feel it, could only feel the cold seeping through her gown as she lifted Marco's head onto her lap, her hands coming away wet with his blood. "Sienna!" His voice was nothing but broken glass and fading light. "I'm here. I'm here. Baby, I'm here." Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup, dripping onto his pale cheeks. "Stay with me, Marco. Please stay with me." His dark eyes found hers, and in them she saw fear. Real, primal fear that the invincible Marco Romano had never shown her before. "I'm sorry," he whispered, blood staining his lips. "For everything. Couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. Stop talking. Save your strength." Her hands pressed against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. But there was so much blood. Too much. "Help is coming. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." But his breathing grew more ragged, his body shuddering with each labored pull of air. His hand found hers, gripping with what little strength remained. "Sienna, promise me. Promise you won't. I promise. I promise anything. Just don't leave me." She bent over him, pressing her forehead to his, her tears mixing with his blood. "I can't do this without you. I don't know how to exist in a world where you're not in it." She didn't know this was theater. Didn't know the blood was theatrical. Didn't know that in a hidden observation room, cameras were recording every word, every tear, every desperate promise falling from her lips. Didn't know Marco's most trusted men had orchestrated this nightmare to satisfy his paranoia. The ghost of a dead first wife who'd betrayed him, the specter of Elena's affair that had twisted his ability to trust into something dark and dangerous. She didn't know it was a test. She only knew the man she loved was dying in her arms, and she would have traded her own life to save his. Medics burst into the room. Dante pulled her away as they worked, but she fought to stay close, her hands still reaching for Marco even as they loaded him onto a stretcher. She climbed into the ambulance, still wearing her blood-soaked emerald gown, still wearing the diamonds that now felt like a mockery of everything real. And when the doctor called time of death 17 minutes later, when Marco's hand went limp in hers and his eyes closed for what she believed was the final time, Sienna Romano's world didn't just break. It shattered into pieces so small. She knew she'd never be whole again. She didn't scream, didn't collapse, She simply sat there in the back of that ambulance, covered in her husband's blood, and felt herself die alongside him. Welcome to Story Lens TV, where we bring you the most emotionally gripping stories that explore love, betrayal, and redemption. What happens when a mafia boss stages his own death to test his wife's loyalty? What happens when the woman who would have followed him into death discovers it was all a cruel game? And what happens when unconditional love becomes the very thing that destroys the man who demanded proof of it? If you want to know what happened at Marco Romano's funeral, what Sienna did that broke the most dangerous man in New York and changed everything, tap that like button to support the channel. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story of love, lies, and the price of paranoia is just beginning. 3 days later, at the funeral, Sienna would do something that would make Marco Romano, watching from the shadows very much alive, realize that some tests destroy the very thing you're trying to prove. And by then, it would be far too late to take it back. 3 years earlier, Sienna Ross had been a different woman entirely. She'd stood in the Artemis Gallery on a cold February night, watching wealthy collectors pass by her carefully curated exhibit without a second glance. 26 years old, drowning in student loans, living in a fifth-floor walk-up in Queens where the heat barely worked and the neighbors fought at 2 in the morning. She'd poured everything into that collection. Months of research, negotiations with artists who could barely afford to eat, her entire vision of how contemporary art could speak to themes of isolation and connection in the modern age. And they walked past it like it was wallpaper. She was contemplating the death of her career when he appeared. Marco Romano, though she didn't know his name yet. Just a figure in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent, moving through the gallery with the quiet confidence of a man who owned every space he entered. Dark hair, darker eyes, and a face that belonged in a Renaissance painting. All sharp angles and dangerous beauty. He stopped in front of her centerpiece, a haunting mixed-media installation about urban loneliness, and stared at it for so long she thought something must be wrong. "Tell me about this," he said without turning. His voice accented with the cadence of someone who'd grown up speaking Italian before English. Sienna approached cautiously, smoothing down her simple black dress, the only professional outfit she owned that wasn't threadbare. "It's about the paradox of connection. How we can be surrounded by millions of people in a city this size and still feel completely alone. You made this." He turned then, and the full weight of his attention was like standing in a spotlight that saw everything. Every insecurity, every hope, every secret she tried to hide. "I curated the exhibit. The artist is. I'll take it." He pulled out his phone, not looking away from her face. "All of it. The entire collection." Sienna's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry, what? How much for everything in this exhibit? I want to buy it all." He said it the way someone else might order coffee, casual and certain, as if dropping what had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars was nothing. "Sir, I don't think you understand the price. I understand that someone poured their soul into curating a story about loneliness, and nobody here is paying attention." His dark eyes held hers. "Accept me. Name your price." That was how it started, with Marco buying her entire exhibit, then insisting on taking her to dinner to discuss delivery arrangements. Dinner turned into drinks on a rooftop overlooking Manhattan, the city lights spreading beneath them like captured stars. Drinks turned into him admitting he'd come to the gallery specifically because he'd read an interview she gave about feeling invisible in the art world, that he'd been following her work for months. "That's either very flattering or very disturbing," Sienna said, champagne making her brave. Marco smiled, and it transformed his face from intimidating to devastating. "Probably both." He courted her like something out of a film noir. Intense, consuming, slightly dangerous. Private jets to Paris for the weekend because she mentioned wanting to see the Rodin Museum. Late-night phone calls where he'd read Pablo Neruda's love poetry in Italian until she fell asleep to the sound of his voice. Rooftop dinners where he'd look at her like she was the only real thing in a city full of illusions. It was 3 months before he told her the truth about his business. They were in his penthouse, a space of leather and dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like they were floating above the city. Marco poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements careful, deliberate, like a man preparing to detonate something. "There are things you should know about me," he said quietly, handing her a glass. "Things that will make you run if you have any sense." Sienna had already suspected. The way men deferred to him in restaurants, the constant presence of armed security, the phone calls he took in Italian that ended with people sounding terrified. She wasn't naive enough to think he'd made his fortune through legitimate business alone. "Tell me," she said simply. So he did. The Romano family's history in organized crime, his father's empire that he'd inherited at 24 when the old man was assassinated. The violence, the blood, the moral compromises that came with power in his world. He laid it out with brutal honesty, never softening the edges, giving her every reason to walk away. "I'll understand if you want to leave," Marco said when he finished, his face carefully blank. "I'll have Dante drive you home. We'll never contact you again." Sienna studied him over the rim of her glass. This man who'd bought her art because he understood loneliness, who read poetry at midnight, who looked at her like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. "Do you hurt innocent people?" she asked. "No. Do you sell drugs to kids? Traffic people?" "Never." His jaw tightened. "I have lines I don't cross." "Then I'm not leaving." She set down her glass and crossed to him. "I don't care about your world, Marco. I care about you." Something in his careful control fractured. He pulled her to him, kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning, whispered Italian against her mouth that she didn't understand but felt in her bones. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony that scandalized his world. No lavish reception, no political alliances formed through strategic invitations. Just them, Dante as witness, and a judge who owed Marco a favor. Sienna wore a simple white dress from a vintage shop in Brooklyn, and Marco looked at her like she'd hung the moon. "You sure about this?" he asked before they exchanged vows, giving her one last chance to run. "I've never been more sure of anything," Sienna replied, and meant it. The first 2 years were happiness she hadn't known existed. Marco was attentive, passionate, protective to the point of obsession. He encouraged her to open her own gallery, funded it without question, showed up at every opening with genuine interest in her artist's work. They traveled Florence, Barcelona, Istanbul, always with security but always together. He learned what she liked for breakfast, remembered the names of her college friends, held her when nightmares about her parents' death woke her crying at 3 a.m. But there were shadows too. Times when she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, something calculating behind the love. Questions that felt like tests. "If I lost everything tomorrow, would you stay? Do you ever think about what you could have had with someone else? If someone offered you money to leave me, how much would it take?" Sienna always answered honestly, assumed he was dealing with the paranoia that came with his dangerous life. She didn't know about Elena, his first wife. Marco never spoke about her, and his men had clearly been instructed to keep that history buried. But Elena's ghost haunted their marriage anyway. By their 3rd anniversary, the questions had intensified. Marco became distant, distracted, watching Sienna with an intensity that felt more like surveillance than adoration. He started inviting Vivian Hartley to the estate more frequently, his security consultant, a platinum blonde with ice-blue eyes who moved through rooms like a predator. Vivian was always professional, always deferential to Sienna, but something in her gaze felt wrong, like she was waiting for something. "She makes me uncomfortable," Sienna told Marco one night after Vivian left from yet another security briefing. "She's the best at what she does," Marco replied without looking up from his laptop. "We need her right now. The Corsinis are making moves." The Corsinis, another crime family, bitter rivals of the Romanos. Marco used them to explain everything lately. His distance, his paranoia, the way he sometimes looked at her like he was trying to solve an equation. Their 3rd anniversary party was Marco's idea. "Something to celebrate," he said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Show everyone we're stronger than ever." So Sienna wore the emerald gown he'd bought her, the diamonds he'd gifted on their 1st anniversary, and played the role of devoted mafia wife while men who'd killed people smiled at her over champagne. She watched Marco move through the crowd with lethal grace. His navy suit fitted perfectly to his powerful frame, neck tattoos visible above his collar, visible marks of a violent past he carried into their present. And she watched Vivian watch Marco, something hungry in those ice-blue eyes. The gunfire shattered the evening like prophecy fulfilled. Sienna had been in the library with Marco, having that conversation about staying versus leaving, when the shots rang out. He'd ordered her to stay put, locked in and safe, while he dealt with the threat. But she'd heard that final shot, that terrible thud, and her body moved before her mind could stop it. She ran toward the sound in her emerald gown, diamonds bouncing against her throat, and found her husband dying on the mahogany floor. The blood looked too red against the elegant navy of his suit. His face had gone gray, lips tinged blue, dark eyes wide with pain and fear. One hand clutched his chest while the other reached for her. For anything. For some proof that he wouldn't die alone in this beautiful room surrounded by beautiful things. Sienna. Her name on his blood-stained lips sounded like goodbye. She fell beside him, lifted his head onto her lap, felt the cold marble through expensive fabric and didn't care. Her hands pressed against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but it soaked through her fingers, stained her emerald dress, pooled around them like a macabre mirror. "I'm here," she whispered, bending over him, her tears falling onto his pale face. "I'm not leaving you. I'll never leave you." His dark eyes found hers, and in them she saw raw terror, not of death, but of dying alone. "I'm sorry," he gasped, each word costing him. "For everything. Couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. Sure, don't talk. Save your strength." But even as she said it, she felt him slipping away. Felt the life draining from his body with each labored breath, each weakening heartbeat. The medics arrived like angels of mercy, but too late, always too late. They loaded him onto a stretcher while Sienna fought to stay close, her blood-soaked hands reaching for him even as they pushed her aside. She climbed into the ambulance still wearing that emerald gown, now ruined, now marked forever with the memory of this night. She held Marco's hand the entire ride, whispering promises into the screaming sirens, that she loved him, that she'd always loved him, that he wasn't alone, that he'd never been alone, not since the day he walked into her gallery and saw her. When his heart stopped, when the monitor went flat, when the doctor called time of death at 11:47 p.m., Sienna didn't make a sound. She simply sat there in the back of that ambulance, covered in her husband's blood, and felt herself die alongside him. If you've ever loved someone so much that losing them would destroy you, if you've ever wondered how far you'd go to prove that love, then you understand what Sienna felt in that moment. And you'll understand what she did 3 days later at Marco's funeral. Something that would break the man who'd orchestrated this nightmare to test her loyalty. The next 72 hours existed in a haze of sedatives and screaming silence. Sienna woke in the master bedroom she'd shared with Marco, the California king suddenly vast and empty without his warmth beside her. Dante was there, Marco's second in command, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. "Mrs. Romano," he said quietly, sitting in the chair beside the bed like he'd been keeping vigil. "I'm so sorry. The Cursinis. They finally succeeded." The words felt distant, meaningless. Marco was dead. What did it matter who'd killed him? Dead was dead. Gone was gone. "The funeral is in 3 days," Dante continued, his voice gentle. "At the family cathedral. I've tripled security around you. You're safe here. Safe." The word was a joke. She'd never feel safe again. Time moved strangely after that. Hours felt like minutes, minutes like hours, all of it blurring into one continuous nightmare she couldn't wake from. Sienna moved through the estate like a ghost, wearing Marco's shirts because they still smelled like him. Tom Ford cologne and whiskey and something uniquely him. She slept on his side of the bed, curled around his pillow, trying to trick her body into believing he was still there. She couldn't eat. Food tasted like ashes, like betrayal, like proof that her body was still functioning when her heart had stopped 3 days ago in an ambulance. In Marco's study, she found things that destroyed her further. A desk drawer full of handwritten poetry, love poems about her, written in his strong, slashing handwriting. Pages and pages of Italian verses comparing her to Florence at dawn, to the first stars appearing over the Adriatic, to every beautiful thing his brutal world had tried to steal from him. She found plane tickets to Florence, scheduled for next month. A surprise trip he'd been planning, tucked away with a note in his handwriting. Show her where I learned to love beauty. Each discovery was a knife, twisting deeper. He'd been planning a future. He'd been writing poetry. He'd been in love with her right up until the moment someone put a bullet in his chest. Vivian Hartley appeared on the second day, ostensibly to help with funeral arrangements. She moved through the estate with eerie efficiency, making decisions about flowers and eulogies with the detachment of someone planning a business meeting rather than a burial. The casket will be closed, Vivian said, checking items off a tablet. Given the nature of his injuries. Sienna nodded numbly, not trusting her voice. She couldn't have looked at Marco's body anyway. Couldn't have borne seeing what bullets had done to the man who'd read her poetry at midnight. That night, alone in the master bedroom with security posted outside her door, Sienna made a decision. She moved to Marco's walk-in closet, to the section where he kept his collection of firearms. Her hands didn't shake as she selected a small pistol, the kind meant for concealed carry. She checked that it was loaded, then slipped it into her handbag. The funeral would be her goodbye, and after saying goodbye, she'd follow him. Because the thought of existing in a world without Marco Romano felt impossible, unbearable, a future she simply couldn't face. She'd promised him he wouldn't die alone. She intended to keep that promise. The Romano family cathedral was a Gothic monument to old money and older power, all vaulted ceilings and stained glass that filtered light into colors that felt holy despite the blood that had paid for them. On the day of Marco's funeral, it filled with hundreds of people. Every major crime family in New York sent representatives, allies and enemies standing shoulder to shoulder in forced respect. Sienna wore black Dior, a dress Marco had bought her for last year's charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd worn it to celebrate life then. Now she wore it to mourn death. A veil covered her face, hiding the hollow devastation in her eyes from curious stares. The closed casket sat at the altar, covered in white roses. White for purity, for new beginnings, for everything Marco had been denied by a life of violence catching up to him. Sienna stared at that gleaming mahogany box and tried to comprehend that her husband's body lay inside, that she'd never again hear his voice reading poetry, never feel his hands gentle on her face, never wake to find him watching her sleep with that expression of wonder and possession. The eulogies were lies. Men who'd feared Marco stood and claimed to have respected him, called him a leader, a visionary, a man who understood honor. Never mentioned the blood on his hands, the bodies that paved his path to power, the darkness that lived beneath the poetry and passion. They didn't know him, Sienna thought distantly. None of them knew the man who cried during old movies, who was afraid of thunderstorms, who wrote love poems in Italian when he couldn't sleep. When it came time for family to pay respects, Sienna stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She walked toward that casket, each step an effort, the weight of the pistol in her handbag a strange comfort. Around her, hundreds of eyes watched, but she couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't feel anything except the vast emptiness where Marco used to be. She reached the casket, placed her hand on the cold wood, and her knees buckled. She collapsed against it, the grief finally breaking through the sedative haze, and sobs tore from her throat with a violence that hurt. "Marco," she whispered against the casket, then louder, "Marco!" The cathedral went silent. Even the priest stopped speaking. In that silence, Sienna began to talk, words spilling out that she'd never intended to say aloud, certainly not in front of strangers. "They think I wanted your money," she said, her voice cracking. "Your empire, your power. But I never wanted any of that, Marco. I wanted the man who was afraid of thunder. The man who read Neruda to me at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep." Her fingers clutched at the wood like she could claw her way inside, like she could join him in death the way she'd joined him in life. "The man who cried watching old movies and pretended he didn't," she continued, tears soaking through her veil. who wrote poetry about me in Italian because he said English wasn't beautiful enough for what he felt. They see a mafia boss. They see a monster. But I saw the boy who lost his mother at 10 and never felt safe again. In a hidden observation room 3 floors below, surrounded by monitors and trusted men, Marco Romano stood very still. He was alive, perfectly healthy. His fatal injuries, nothing but theatrical makeup and carefully choreographed performance. The blood had been fake. The death had been staged. The funeral was theater designed to prove whether his wife loved him or loved his empire. But as he watched Sienna collapse against his casket on the security monitors, as her words echoed through speakers into the observation room, something in his chest began to crack. "I can't do this," Sienna was saying, still pressed against the casket. "I can't exist in a world where you're not in it. I don't know how. I don't know how to breathe without you." She straightened then, and Marco saw her reach into her handbag, saw her pull out something small and metallic, saw her press it to her temple before anyone could react. Pistol. His pistol from his collection. "No," Marco breathed, lunging toward the monitors as if he could reach through them. "I can't live in a world where you don't exist," Sienna whispered into the terrible silence of the cathedral. "So I won't." Dante moved fast, had been positioned specifically to intervene if Sienna tried anything drastic. But even he almost wasn't fast enough. He lunged forward, grabbed her wrist, wrenched the gun away just as her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went wide, exploding into stained glass, sending colored shards raining down like broken prayers. Sienna screamed, a sound of pure anguish that didn't sound human. She fought Dante with shocking violence, clawing at him, trying to reach the gun. "Let me go. Let me go to him. Marco. Marco." It took 3 men to hold her while someone administered a sedative. Even drugged, being carried out of the cathedral, she kept screaming Marco's name, the sound echoing off Gothic arches like a curse. In the observation room, Marco Romano fell to his knees. The man who'd built an empire on ruthlessness, who'd killed without hesitation, who'd never shown weakness, crumbled. Tears streamed down his face as he watched the monitors, watched his wife being sedated and carried away, still screaming for him. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "Dio mio, what have I done?" His most trusted men stood frozen, unsure how to respond to their boss breaking down completely. This had been his plan, the fake assassination, the elaborate funeral, the test to prove whether Sienna loved him or his empire. He'd been so certain, so paranoid after Elena's betrayal 5 years ago, so unable to trust that he'd orchestrated this nightmare. And his wife had just tried to kill herself rather than live without him. "Boss," one of his men said carefully, Do we proceed to the next phase?" The next phase had been to reveal himself alive if Sienna passed the test, to show her the videos, explain his reasoning, and ask for understanding. He'd convinced himself she'd forgive him once she understood why he'd needed proof. But watching her now, sedated, broken, having nearly blown her brains out in a cathedral full of witnesses, Marco realized how catastrophically he'd miscalculated. She'd given him proof of her love, the most brutal, final proof imaginable. And in doing so, she'd destroyed him far more completely than any bullet ever could. "Get me to the estate," Marco said hoarsely, wiping his face with hands that shook. "I'm ending this. Now." 3 days later, Sienna woke in a room she didn't recognize. White walls, medical equipment, the soft beeping of monitors. For a moment she thought she was in a hospital, that the funeral had been the hallucination, that Marco might actually be alive. Then memory crashed back, and with it, crushing disappointment that she'd woken at all. She was in one of the estate's guest rooms, converted into a medical suite. Under psychiatric care, she'd learn later. Under suicide watch after what she'd done at the funeral. The sedatives made everything fuzzy, made her body feel distant and unimportant. Good. She didn't want to feel her body. Didn't want to acknowledge that her heart still beat while Marco's had stopped. Night fell. Or maybe it was already night and she'd lost time. Hours blurred together in the haze of medication. Then, through the fog, she became aware of someone in the room. a figure sitting in the shadows, silent and still. "Dante?" she murmured, assuming Marco's second-in-command was keeping watch. The figure stood, moved closer, and a lamp clicked on. Marco Romano stood beside her bed. Alive. Real. Wearing the same navy suit from the night of the party. His dark eyes haunted and red-rimmed. His face etched with exhaustion. Sienna stared at him, uncomprehending. This had to be another hallucination, her grief-broken mind conjuring him from memory. She'd read about this, widows seeing their dead husbands, the brain's desperate attempt to cope with unbearable loss. "You're not real," she whispered. "I'm real, Sienna." His voice cracked on her name. "I'm alive." It was a test. The words didn't make sense. She reached out with one hand, expecting it to pass through air, through fantasy. But her fingers met solid warmth, the familiar texture of expensive fabric, the shape of him she knew better than her own body. He was real. Understanding detonated in her chest like a bomb. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no. Sienna." Rage exploded through the sedative fog, primal and ferocious. She launched herself at him, fists pounding his chest, screaming wordlessly. Marco let her hit him, didn't defend himself, just stood there accepting her fury like penance. "You let me think you were dead," she screamed, each word torn from her throat. "I held you. Your blood was all over me. I watched you die. I know. I tried to kill myself at your funeral." Her voice broke. "I put a gun to my head, Marco. I was going to follow you into death. And you were watching from a fucking camera." That made him flinch, made pain flash across his face. Good. She wanted him to hurt the way she hurt. "Why?" she demanded, her fists still beating against his chest even as exhaustion weakened the blows. "Why would you do this to me?" Marco caught her wrists gently but firmly, held them still. His eyes, those dark eyes she'd loved, that had looked at her with such passion, were now filled with guilt and something broken. "Elena," he said quietly, "my first wife. She was having an affair with my best friend, my business partner. They were planning to kill me, inherit everything. I found out and I killed them both." Sienna went still, the fight draining out of her. "That was 5 years ago," Marco continued, his voice rough, "and I haven't been able to trust anyone since. I kept thinking, what if you're like her? What if you're waiting for me to die so you can take the empire? What if everything between us is a lie? So you tested me." Her voice had gone cold, dead. "You staged your own assassination to see if I'd mourn you or celebrate your death." "I needed to know," he said, and she heard desperation in it. "I needed to know if you loved me or the empire I built. If you'd stay when I had nothing." Sienna pulled her wrists from his grip, stepped back, and the look she gave him was colder than any rage. It was disappointment. It was disgust. It was the death of something precious. "You could have just asked me," she said quietly. 3 years, Marco. 3 years of marriage, and you couldn't just talk to me? Trust me? You had to torture me to satisfy your paranoia." "I realized my mistake," Marco said quickly, desperately. "At the funeral, when you spoke to the casket, when you said all those things, I knew. I knew you loved me. And when you pulled that gun," his voice broke. "Dio mio, Sienna, when you put it to your head, I thought I'd killed you. I thought my test would actually kill you. But you didn't stop it before then," Sienna said. "You let me grieve. Let me plan to die. Let me live in hell for 3 days because you needed proof. I'm sorry." Tears were streaming down his face now, the fearsome Mafia boss crying like a child. "I'm so sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. I'll do anything." "There's nothing you can do," Sienna interrupted. "You broke something, Marco. Something fundamental. You proved that your paranoia matters more than my pain. That your inability to trust matters more than our marriage." She moved to the closet, began pulling out clothes with mechanical precision. Her hands didn't shake. She felt eerily calm, like she'd moved past emotion into some realm beyond it. "What are you doing?" Marco asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Leaving," She threw clothes into a bag without looking at him. You wanted to know if I'd stay when you had nothing? Here's your answer. I would have stayed through poverty, through danger, through anything. But I can't stay through betrayal this profound. Sienna, please. She turned then, and the look in her eyes made him take a step back. You watched me try to kill myself, Marco. You sat in that observation room with your men and watched me press a gun to my temple. You heard me scream your name as they sedated me. And you still think you have the right to ask me to stay. I love you, he said desperately. You love control, she corrected. You love certainty. You love the idea of a wife who proved her devotion by almost dying for you. But you don't love me enough to trust me. And I deserve better than that. She finished packing, zipped the bag, and walked toward the door. Marco moved to block her path, but something in her expression stopped him. If you love me at all, Sienna said quietly, you'll let me go. He stood aside, his face crumbling, hands fisted at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Sienna walked past him, out of the medical room, down the marble hallway of the estate that had been her home. She walked past Dante, who looked at her with guilt and apology, past other staff members who'd known about the test and said nothing, past the life she'd built with a man who'd loved her but not enough. She didn't look back. Behind her, in that empty medical room, Marco Romano collapsed against the wall and wept. He'd tested his wife's love and proven it beyond doubt. And in doing so, he'd destroyed the only real thing he'd ever had. Some tests he was learning don't prove love. They destroy it. The apartment in Queens looked smaller than Sienna remembered. 5 floors up, no elevator. The same cracked tile in the hallway that had been there when she'd left 3 years ago to move into Marco's estate. She stood at the threshold with her single bag, keys trembling in her hand, and felt the weight of what she'd walked away from. This place was hers, though. Bought with her own money before Marco, paid for with gallery commissions and 60-hour work weeks. Tiny, barely 600 square feet, with a kitchen the size of a closet and windows that overlooked a brick wall. But it wasn't tainted by Marco's deception. It wasn't haunted by the ghost of a test that had nearly killed her. She stepped inside and closed the door, locking out the world, locking out the life she'd left behind. The first thing she did was block Marco's number, then Dante's, then every other contact connected to the Romano family. She wanted isolation, complete and total, the kind of silence where she could hear herself think without the echo of lies. Marco called anyway from different numbers dozens of times a day. She let them all go to voicemail, deleted them without listening. Dante showed up at her door 3 times in the first week. She didn't answer, just sat on her threadbare couch listening to him apologize through the door until he finally left. She wanted to be alone, needed to be alone, needed space to figure out who Sienna Ross was without Marco Romano. Across the city, in the estate that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, Marco was unraveling. He drank expensive whiskey straight from the bottle at 2 in the morning, standing in the library where he'd staged his death, staring at the spot on the floor where Sienna had held him. He made reckless business decisions, picking fights with rival families, taking risks that made his men nervous. "Boss, the Cursinis are moving on our territory," Dante reported one night, finding Marco drunk in his study. "We need to respond." "But you're not." "Not what?" Marco snarled, his words slurred. "Not thinking clearly? Not acting like a boss?" "You're right. I'm not. Because I destroyed the only thing that mattered for a fucking test that proved nothing except that I'm a monster." Dante sat down heavily, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "You tested her love and destroyed it," he said quietly. "Was it worth it?" Marco's laugh was bitter, broken. "No. God, no. I'd give anything, everything to undo it. But I can't. I can't take back what I did to her." Word spread through the underworld that Marco Romano was weak, distracted, vulnerable. His empire began to crack as rivals sensed opportunity. Territory disputes escalated. Shipments went missing. Men who'd sworn loyalty started taking meetings with competitors. Marco didn't care. Let the empire burn. He'd built it with blood and ruthlessness, but what good was power without Sienna? What was the point of an empire if he'd destroyed his soul to keep it? 2 months into the separation, Sienna woke up nauseous for the 5th morning in a row. At first, she blamed it on grief, on the way trauma could manifest physically. But when she couldn't keep food down, when her period was 3 weeks late, when exhaustion hit her like a physical weight, she bought a pregnancy test at the pharmacy on the corner. She took it in her tiny bathroom, hands shaking, and watched 2 pink lines appear like a verdict. Pregnant. Sienna sat on the closed toilet lid and stared at that positive test. Emotions warring inside her so violently she couldn't name them. This felt like a cruel joke. Carrying the child of a man who'd broken her, who'd orchestrated her torture to satisfy his paranoia. A permanent connection to someone she was trying desperately to forget. But as her hand moved to her still flat stomach, something else bloomed beneath the anger and pain. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but undeniably there. She'd always wanted children, had dreamed of it with Marco back when she'd believed their marriage was built on trust. The baby wasn't responsible for its father's sins, and despite everything, despite the betrayal and the test and the way Marco had shattered her, some part of her still loved him. Hated that she loved him, but couldn't stop. She made the decision sitting on that bathroom floor. She'd keep the baby, but she wouldn't tell Marco. He'd lost the right to this part of her life when he'd chosen paranoia over trust. Meanwhile, at the Romano estate, Vivian Hartley had become a regular presence. She appeared at Marco's door with reports about security threats, business opportunities, anything to justify her visits. Always dressed impeccably in power suits that emphasized her sharp beauty, always professional, always watching Marco with those ice-blue eyes that held calculation beneath concern. "You need to eat," she said one evening, finding him in his study surrounded by empty bottles. "You're destroying yourself over a woman who left you." "She left because I destroyed her first," Marco said without looking up. Vivian moved closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, let it linger. "You did what you had to do. Elena taught you that trust is earned, not given." Sienna failed to understand that. Marco shrugged off her touch, finally meeting her eyes. Sienna understood perfectly. That's why she left. "And if you're here for any reason other than business, Vivian, you can go." "Marco, I don't want anyone else," he said flatly. "I don't want you. I only want Sienna, and I've lost her. So whatever you think is happening here, whatever opportunity you think you see, forget it." Something flickered across Vivian's face. Hurt, then anger, then something colder and more dangerous. "You're making a mistake." "I already made my mistake," Marco replied. "Now leave." Vivian left, her heels striking marble with staccato fury. But as she climbed into her car, as she drove away from the estate, something dark solidified in her chest. She'd loved Marco Romano for 8 years, had worked for him, protected him, suggested the very test that had driven Sienna away. All with the assumption that when his marriage failed, when Sienna proved herself unworthy or greedy or weak, Marco would finally see Vivian. But Sienna had passed the test spectacularly, had proven love so profound it had broken Marco instead of reassuring him. And even with Sienna gone, even with the marriage destroyed, Marco still wanted her. If Vivian couldn't have Marco, she decided, then neither could Sienna. It was time to ensure that separation became permanent. For months into living alone, into rebuilding some semblance of a life, Sienna started noticing she was being followed. A black SUV with tinted windows appeared outside her apartment building, the same one she'd see later at the grocery store, at her prenatal appointments. Strange men in suits watched her from across streets, too obvious to be professional, too persistent to be coincidence. Her first thought was Marco, that despite her clear boundaries, despite her rejection, he'd assigned protection without asking. The arrogance of it made her furious. She called Dante from a burner phone, bypassing the block on her main cell. "Tell Marco to call off his dogs," she said when he answered, not bothering with pleasantries. "I see them everywhere. If he thinks surveillance is going to win me back." "Mrs. Romano, wait," Dante interrupted. Marco gave explicit orders not to surveil you. He promised complete space. Those men aren't ours. Sienna's blood went cold. Then whose are they? Stay where you are, Dante said urgently. I'm sending protection right now. Don't go anywhere alone until... She hung up, her hand shaking. If Marco's men weren't following her, then who? The Corsinis, trying to hurt Marco through her? One of his other enemies. That night, driving home from a doctor's appointment, she found out. The attack came on a quiet street in Queens. No witnesses. Perfectly planned. A sedan swerved into her lane without warning, forcing her off the road. Sienna's car spun, tires screaming, and slammed into a parked vehicle with a sickening crunch of metal. Airbags deployed, the impact stealing her breath, and for a terrible moment all she could think was, the baby. She barely had time to register pain before the sedan's doors opened and men emerged. 3 of them, armed, moving toward her wrecked car with clear intent. Then gunfire erupted from somewhere else. Dante's men, who'd been tracking her since her phone call, racing to intervene. The attackers scattered, their sedan speeding away, and Sienna sat trapped in her destroyed car, ears ringing, hands pressed to her stomach. Police came, paramedics, Dante himself, his face white with fear. Are you hurt? The baby? You're pregnant. I'm okay, Sienna said, though she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Minor cuts, but check the baby. Please check the baby. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the baby was fine. Her body had protected it, the airbag and seatbelt had done their jobs. But Sienna sat in that examination room feeling the full weight of how close she'd come to losing everything. Dante ran the license plates of the sedan, called in favors with corrupt cops on Romano payroll. The trail led to the Corsini family, Marco's rivals. But further investigation revealed something else. Financial transfers from an offshore account belonging to Vivian Hartley. She hired them, Dante told Marco in the estate's secure room, his voice tight with fury. Vivian paid the Corsinis to eliminate Sienna. She's been planning this for weeks. Marco's world tilted. Vivian, the woman he'd trusted for years, who'd suggested the test, who'd been present for every moment of his unraveling. There's more, Dante said quietly. Sienna's pregnant. For months. She didn't want you to know. If you've ever realized that your actions set in motion consequences you never intended, consequences that threaten the people you love most, then you understand what Marco felt hearing that his wife, his pregnant wife, had nearly died because of his world, his choices, his paranoia. Drop a comment if you've ever had to fight to undo damage you caused. Marco's reaction was primal, volcanic. He mobilized his entire organization within an hour, every soldier, every contact, every resource directed toward one goal: protecting Sienna. Whether she wanted his protection or not, whether she'd ever forgive him or not, he would keep her alive. And bring me Vivian Hartley, he said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. Now. They found her at her penthouse in Manhattan, packing a go-bag like she'd been planning to run. Marco arrived with Dante and 6 armed men, kicked in her door with all the rage of a man who'd been betrayed one too many times. Vivian didn't even try to deny it. She stood in her living room in blood-red Armani, platinum hair perfect, and smiled like she'd been expecting him. You should have chosen me, she said coldly, ice-blue eyes meeting his. I would never have failed your test. You helped me plan that test, Marco said, advancing on her slowly. You suggested it. Why? Because I thought Sienna would fail, Vivian said simply. I thought she'd show her true colors. Greed, relief, something that proved she was like Elena. And when she did, you'd finally see that I've been here all along. That I've loved you for 8 years. That I earned you. You don't love me, Marco said with disgust. You love what I represent. Power, danger, control. Sienna loved the man, not the boss. That's why I tested her. And that's why she's worth more than this entire fucking empire. Vivian laughed bitterly. And look where that got you. Alone. Pathetic. Drinking yourself to death while your empire crumbles. I would have stood by you. You tried to murder my pregnant wife, Marco said softly, and the quietness of his voice was more terrifying than any shout. You hired assassins to eliminate the woman carrying my child. For the first time, Vivian's composure cracked. She shouldn't exist. If she's gone, you'll finally move on. Take her, Marco said to his men. Call our contacts in the NYPD. Attempted murder charges. Make sure they stick. As they pulled Vivian away, she screamed at him. You're making a mistake. She'll never take you back. She'll raise your bastard alone and you'll die alone and... Dante slammed the door, cutting off her voice. Boss, he said carefully. There's a problem. Vivian had contingencies. Hired killers she set in motion before we arrested her. The hit on Sienna is still active. When? Marco's voice was steel. Tomorrow. And Vivian can't call it off even from custody. These are professionals. Marco was already moving, pulling out his phone. Get every man we have to Sienna's location. Now. And keep calling her until she answers. But Sienna wasn't answering. Why would she? She'd blocked them all, wanted nothing to do with the Romano family. And tomorrow, professional killers would come for her and she wouldn't even know. Sienna was at a prenatal appointment when Marco's men descended on the clinic like an invading army. 6 SUVs, a dozen armed men in suits, and Dante himself striding into the waiting room like it was a war zone. Mrs. Romano, we need to move you now, Dante said, ignoring the stares of other patients and staff. Are you insane? Sienna stood, fury overriding fear. You can't just storm into a doctor's office with guns. There's a credible threat. Dante interrupted, his voice urgent. Professional hit, imminent danger. I'll explain everything, but we need to get you somewhere safe. Something in his expression, in the barely controlled panic beneath his professional calm, made Sienna stop arguing. She let them escort her out, into an armored SUV with bulletproof glass. They were transporting her to a safe house Marco maintained in upstate New York when the ambush happened. 3 cars full of armed men appeared on a quiet stretch of road, boxing in the convoy. Windows exploded in a hail of gunfire, metal tearing, voices shouting. Sienna froze in the back seat as bullets punctured doors and shattered glass around her, as the world turned into chaos and screaming and the certainty of death. Then another vehicle arrived, a black sedan driving with reckless speed. Marco burst from it before it fully stopped, armed, his face a mask of focused violence. He tracked them via GPS, had been following at a distance, and now he ran towards Sienna's bullet-riddled SUV with no regard for his own safety. He yanked open the door, and Sienna saw him silhouetted against gunfire like something from a nightmare. Stay down, he shouted, covering her body with his own. 3 bullets hit him in rapid succession. Shoulder, chest, abdomen. The impacts drove him forward, pressing him harder against Sienna, and she felt his blood. Real blood this time, not theatrical. Soaking hot through her clothes. He didn't make a sound, didn't cry out, just held her tighter as if he could shield her from the world with his body. Dante's men eliminated the attackers with brutal efficiency. The street went silent except for ringing ears and someone crying. Sienna realized the crying was coming from her. Marco, she tried to push him back, to see his face, and her hands came away red. Marco, no. No, please, not again. His eyes met hers, storm-dark and clouded with pain, but present, aware. Real fear lived in them this time, not the staged fear of his test, but genuine terror of leaving her. No more tests, he whispered, blood staining his lips. Just stay with me. The parallelism wasn't lost on Sienna. For months ago, she'd held him on a library floor, believing him dead, promising not to leave. Now she held him on a blood-soaked street, knowing he'd taken bullets meant for her, watching him fade for real. I'm here, she said, repeating words from that terrible night. I'm not going anywhere. You're going to be fine. But she wasn't sure. There was so much blood, and his breathing had turned shallow, ragged. Ambulances arrived, real ones this time, not staged. Paramedics worked on Marco with urgent efficiency while Sienna rode beside him, holding his hand, feeling his pulse weak and thready beneath her fingers. In the ER, doctors disappeared with him into surgery. Sienna sat in the waiting room covered in his blood. Again. But this time everything was different. Before, he'd been testing her. Now he'd saved her without hesitation, without agenda, without any expectation of what it would prove. He'd thrown his body over hers and their unborn child without thinking. Pure instinct, pure love. 6 hours of surgery. 6 hours of Sienna pacing in blood-stained clothes, refusing to change, hands pressed to her stomach where their baby grew. Dante brought her updates. 1 bullet removed from his shoulder, working on the chest wound. The abdominal injury complicated but manageable. Finally, a surgeon emerged. He'll survive. Critical condition but stable. Very lucky. Sienna's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair and sobbed. Relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. Fear that had been held back by shock finally breaking through. She realized, sitting in that sterile waiting room, that despite everything he'd done, despite the betrayal and the test and the way he'd broken her, she didn't want him dead. Couldn't bear the thought of a world without Marco Romano in it. Maybe love wasn't something that ended cleanly. Maybe it persisted even through unforgivable things, messy and painful and complicated. 3 days later, Marco woke in a private hospital room. The first thing he saw was Sienna asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on her stomach, visibly pregnant now that he knew to look for it. He watched her for a long time, memorizing details he'd taken for granted before. The curve of her cheek, the way her hair fell across her face, the exhaustion evident even in sleep. His wife, the mother of his child, the woman he'd broken and who'd still stayed by his side after he'd nearly died saving her. "Sienna," he said, his voice rough from intubation. She startled awake, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her clothes rumpled from days in that chair. She looked beautiful and terrible and alive. "You saved me," she said quietly. "You almost died saving me." "I would do it again," Marco replied. "Every time. No test. Just love." Sienna's face crumpled, tears streaming fresh. "I'm still so angry at you," she said. "What you did was unforgivable. The test, the funeral, watching me try to kill myself. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive that." "I know," Marco said, reaching for her hand with his good arm. "I'll spend my life making it up to you, however long it takes." "I'm pregnant," she said, though he clearly already knew. "For months. It's a girl." Marco broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face, and he cried like he hadn't since his mother's death when he was 10. Cried for the test that had nearly destroyed them both, for the baby he'd almost never known about, for the woman who'd loved him despite every reason not to. "I don't deserve you," he said through tears. "I don't deserve this child." "No," Sienna agreed, and her honesty was both brutal and freeing. "You don't. But I'm choosing to give you another chance anyway." "Why?" Marco asked, genuinely not understanding. "Not because you tested me," Sienna said firmly. "Not because you saved me, but because despite everything, I still love you. And because our daughter deserves a father. And because," her voice broke, "because love isn't something you prove, Marco. It's something you choose, every single day." Marco pulled her close with his good arm, buried his face in her hair, and promised. "No more tests, no more paranoia, complete honesty, couples therapy, whatever you need." "We're starting over," Sienna said, "not picking up where we left off. Starting fresh, building something new on truth instead of fear." "Deal," Marco whispered. Vivian was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder, conspiracy, and a list of other charges Marco's lawyers ensured would stick. She screamed at her sentencing that Marco had destroyed her, that she'd given him everything. But all Marco felt watching her led away was pity. She'd loved an image, not a person, and it had consumed her. 6 months later, Isabella Rose Romano was born at 3:47 a.m. Marco held his daughter with tears streaming down his face. This tiny perfect thing that was part him and part Sienna, physical proof that love could survive even his worst mistakes. "She has your eyes," Sienna said from the hospital bed, exhausted but smiling. "She has your goodness," Marco replied, pressing a kiss to Isabella's forehead. "Thank God for that." They moved slowly, carefully, rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time. Marco attended therapy, individual and couples, facing demons he'd spent 36 years avoiding. Sienna learned to voice her needs instead of sacrificing them, learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, learned that she could love Marco and still hold him accountable. 1 year after the real shooting, after Marco had nearly died for real, they renewed their vows. Not in a cathedral with hundreds of witnesses, but in the small garden of the estate with just Dante, a handful of trusted friends, and Isabella in Sienna's arms. "I promise to trust you," Marco said, his voice steady, "to choose vulnerability over control, to never test what I should simply believe. I promise to speak my truth," Sienna replied. Afterward, they found themselves in the library where it had all begun, where Marco had staged his fake death, where Sienna had held him covered in theatrical blood. Marco could barely look at the spot on the mahogany floor, the ghost of his worst mistake haunting the elegant room. "I hate this room," he said quietly. "I hate what I did here." Sienna took his hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the lamplight. "We can't erase the past," she said, "but we can build a better future. This room doesn't have to be about the test anymore. It can be about what came after, about choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away." Marco pulled her close, careful of her still healing body, and held her like something precious he'd nearly lost. "No more tests," he whispered against her hair. "No more tests," Sienna agreed, tilting her face up to kiss him. "Only love, every single day." They stood there in the library where their love had been tested and broken and rebuilt, holding each other while their daughter slept nearby and the future stretched before them uncertain but possible. The ghosts of paranoia and betrayal would always haunt the edges of their marriage, but they'd learned something invaluable. Real love isn't proven through tests but through choice. The daily choice to trust, to forgive, to believe that someone broken can heal if given the chance. Marco Romano had faked his own death to test his wife's loyalty. What happened at the funeral broke him. But what happened after, the separation, the near death, the rebuilding, saved them both. So I have to ask, can love survive betrayal this profound? When someone you trust completely tests that trust in the cruelest way possible, is forgiveness even possible? Or are some wounds too deep to ever fully heal? What would you have done in Sienna's place? Walked away forever, or fought for a love that nearly destroyed you? Thank you for watching and listening to this story about love, trust, and the tests that break us or make us stronger. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone isn't proving that love exists. It's choosing to keep loving them even after they've proven they don't trust it.